Hans, Mr. Beatbox Chillist. Whoop, whoop. Our speaker today is our very own Dr. Lindsay. He's the Vice President of Academic Affairs and our Dean of our faculty. I'm so glad he's going to come and share. I've been thankful during this season, as we've been in the story, to have so many of our own professors and theologians and everything come and share. And I know I always appreciate when he comes and shares. We're going to begin with our video. It's going to be the kind of intro to this part of the section in the story that we're in. This is actually week or session 23. So if you've been with us during this entire time, there have been 23 different sessions in the story. We only have about 8 or so left, about 7 to 8 of those left. This is the beginning of Jesus' ministry. And so Terry kind of launched this last week around the birth of Christ and the whole idea of the genealogies and all those fun things. And then Dennis is going to begin with the beginning of Jesus' ministry. He's not feeling the greatest, and so after the video is done, when he comes up, would you just cheer him a loud and see you cheer to kind of give him that extra adrenaline boost that he needs to share this morning. So give your attention to the video.
Yeah, if you just keep that up for the next 30 minutes, we'll be all right. I want to share with you today a passage that comes from the beginning of Jesus' ministry, and it comes up in Mark's gospel. In the very first chapter, it talks about Jesus appearing at the synagogue in Capernaum. And I want to talk to you today in terms of Jesus' ministry, about a tale of two synagogues. And you'll catch the first one, obviously, as we go through. Listen for the second one as well, and we'll see where we get to. Here's the text, starting in Mark chapter 1, verse 21. They went to Capernaum, and when the Sabbath came, he entered the synagogue and taught. They were astounded at his teaching, for he taught them as one having authority and not as the scribes. Just then there was in their synagogue a man with an unclean spirit, and he cried out, "What have you to do with us, Jesus of Nazareth? Have you come to destroy us? I know who you are, the Holy One of God." But Jesus rebuked him, saying, "Be silent and come out of him." And the unclean spirit, convulsing him and crying with a loud voice, came out of him. They were all amazed, and they kept on asking one another, "What is this? A new teaching and with authority. He commands even the unclean spirits, and they obey him." At once his fame began to spread throughout the surrounding region of Galilee. As soon as they left the synagogue, they entered the house of Simon and Andrew with James and John. Now, Simon's mother-in-law was in bed with a fever, just like the rest of us. And they told him about her at once. He came and took her by the hand and lifted her up. Then the fever left her, and she began to serve them. That evening at sundown, they brought to him all who were sick or possessed with demons. And the whole city was gathered together around the door. And he cured many who were sick with various diseases, and cast out many demons. And he would not permit the demons to speak, because they knew him. I'm intrigued by the rather matter-of-fact way that Mark tells us about this beginning of Jesus' ministry and a man possessed by an unclean spirit attending synagogue in Capernaum on the Sabbath day. This was the place for worship on the day of worship. Now, does that strike any of you as a little bit odd? Especially if you were to replace the word synagogue with its synonym, church. A demon-possessed person in church? When was the last time you experienced something like this at church? Someone possessed by a demon standing up and crying out in your worship service in opposition to Christ? Ever happen? Well, I think with this account of the beginning of Jesus' ministry, Mark wants to capture our attention and perhaps even challenge our understanding of what it means, first of all, to be possessed of an unclean spirit, and second, what it means to be part of Christ's synagogue, part of Christ's church. Indeed, if we look closely at the text, we see that Mark presents us with a scenario of two contrasting synagogues in the city of Capernaum. Now, the first synagogue is fairly straightforward. It was the structure where Jews in the city would gather for worship. And the picture that you have here are the ruins of the first century synagogue. There's a floor plan. The next picture is the floor plan of this Jewish synagogue that dates from the first century. It's probably the synagogue that Jesus attended there. From the floor plan, it's about 70 feet wide and about 90 feet to 100 feet in length. I walked off our chapel space this morning. The synagogue there was probably almost twice the space that we have here. That's about the size that we're looking at. If you were to inquire of anyone in Capernaum around 30 A.D. about the synagogue, this is probably where they would have pointed you, to this one here. It would have been quite an elegant landmark in that ancient city. Now, to find the second synagogue in this story, we have to do a little bit more digging in the text. No archaeological pun intended. In verse 29, Mark tells us that Jesus left the synagogue, that is synagogue number 1, the one that we were just looking at, and he entered into a nearby house. Specifically, it says this was the house of Peter and Andrew. Here, Jesus healed Peter's mother-in-law, and later in the evening after Sabbath was over, he healed a number of people who were sick with all kinds of diseases, and he cast out many demons. Now, the further excavation shows us some of these houses and what they would have looked like there. We don't know exactly which house would have been Simon Peter and Andrew's house, although they've identified one that they call that. But in verse 33, here's the important thing. Mark tells us that the whole city had gathered in front of the door of this house. And when I used to teach Greek, my motto was always, Greek can be fun. And this is where Greek gets to be a little bit fun, I think. The word for gather together in Greek is synago. And if you hear that, you might get the idea that this is where we get synagogue from. It's the place where people gathered together. And so Mark tells us that people were synagoguing at the door of the house where Jesus was staying. And this, I suggest to you, was the second synagogue. This house, not the big floor plan there, but one of those little cubicles that you see somewhere around that synagogue where Jesus was staying and people were synagoguing at the door. We see the same thing coming up in Luke or in Mark chapter 2, verse 2, where Jesus returns to the house and people are gathering together once again. In fact, in several places in Mark's gospel, we see this verb synago, this gathering together, used of Jesus' ministry, and it's always talking about crowds. And a couple of times it's talking about when Jesus was teaching or preaching along the seaside. People gathered together to him. They synagogued to him. But if we look at these two synagogues here in Mark 1 and compare them, there are a number of differences that we could point out. First of all, you can see how large and prominent the first synagogue is in comparison to how the second synagogue might have taken place. One synagogue is very formal, the other one very spontaneous. One synagogue is very elegant, and the other one pretty humble. In the first instance, Jesus goes to the synagogue. In the second instance, the synagogue goes to Jesus. So there are a number of interesting differences between these two synagogues. But perhaps the most significant difference that we find in this text has to do with the people who actually gather at each of the synagogues. Mark tells us that the whole city gathered together at the door of the house where Jesus was. Now, is that possible? On the one hand, this obviously seems an exaggeration, as you can clearly see from this aerial view there. There's no way that the whole city could gather in front of that one of those little cubicle houses there. The houses are small. The streets are narrow. There's no way that the whole city could physically have gathered in front of the door. But the point that Mark is making is that this place of gathering is actually a public place. The point is that anyone and everyone in the city of Capernaum could gather here, legally, without censure, whether they were Jews or Gentiles, whether they were pro-Rome or anti-Rome, whether they were men or women or children, whether they were slave or free, whether they were pro-gun control or anti-gun control, pro-life or pro-choice, communist, capitalist, Democrat, Republican, independent, pacifist, non-pacifist, healthy, sick, gay, straight, clean, and unclean. No one is excluded from this synagogue. It's open to the whole city. By contrast, the first synagogue, even though it had a much greater seating capacity, was generally exclusive. It was a place of privilege, where only a certain group of people would actually have felt at home, and where others would have been allowed to enter only as second-class citizens, or perhaps not allowed to enter at all. Women, for instance, would have been relegated to the side passages or a back room and not allowed in the main assembly hall. They would have been standing in this second-class gallery along with many other curious or pious non-Jews who dared to enter. Sick people would have been discouraged from entering, as would anyone who was considered to be a sinner or ceremonially unclean or illegal in any way. Precisely the people, the very people whom we see freely gathering at the second synagogue. These would have been excluded in the first one. In fact, and it's interesting here, the only ones that we see explicitly welcome in both synagogues are persons who are possessed by unclean spirits or demons. But even here, there's a significant difference. In the first synagogue, we get the impression that the man with the unclean spirit was generally allowed by everyone but Jesus to speak freely, while in the second synagogue, the demons are not allowed to speak at all. Which brings me back to my initial fascination with this story in Mark's gospel. Why was a man with an unclean spirit allowed to speak in the synagogue? For that matter, why was someone with an unclean spirit even allowed to enter the synagogue? This is particularly amazing given the strong sense of ritual purity in the pious Jewish community and their separation of clean and unclean. You would not expect someone unclean allowed to enter in. Who was this man? What was the unclean spirit that possessed him? And what in heaven's name was he doing speaking up in the synagogue? Let me suggest one possible solution to this riddle. Who was the man? I would suggest to you that he was not an outsider like we might at first think, but rather a regular, established, acknowledged member of the Capernaum synagogue. I don't think that he was just some weirdo happening in off the streets. I've encountered that in my ministry. I remember in Germany when I was pastor there, and Dr. Heine and Jill will recall this too. We often had people wandering in off the streets to our church, either in the English worship service or the German worship service. It was right along the street. It didn't really look like a church, and sometimes people, beggars, would wander in off the street, just and disrupt everything. There was one time someone like this wandered in the middle of a worship service and started asking in German. This was an English worship service, fortunately, I think. He wandered in and started asking if anyone had an extra pair of underpants. Now, I'm not going to go into any more of that story on this. There was a situation of clean and unclean going on, but that's not what we're talking about here. I don't think that's what we have in the synagogue in Capernaum, where someone is just wandering in, creating chaos. I think that this person was likely a respected member of the synagogue. This would help us to answer the other part of the riddle, that is, why was he allowed to speak in the synagogue? Why was he allowed to speak openly? As a regular member of the synagogue, he had every right to speak up, especially if he recognized some impending danger for the synagogue. And notice what this man says. What do you have to do with us, Jesus of Nazareth? Have you come to destroy us? Now, he's not talking only about himself. He's not talking about me. Neither is he talking about Jesus destroying a plurality of demonic powers. In the Greek here, the evil spirit or the unclean spirit is singular. But this man says us. The us that he's talking about may very well be the collective us of the Capernaum synagogue. And his voice of protest may very well have to do with their own voice of protest as fellow synagogue members recognize Jesus posing a threat to the way they understand themselves. This man in the synagogue is not speaking out of place, I would suggest, but he's speaking out of privilege. The kind of privilege that people claim for themselves when they want to practice, to propagate, to protect an exclusive religious community. A community that discriminates against outsiders, a community that denies privilege to those outside whom they deserve undeserving, or whom they deem undeserving of privilege, especially if it's people that they want to write off as lawbreakers, illegal, illegitimate, as sinners. And this, I think, helps to sort out the third piece of the riddle. What exactly was the unclean spirit that possessed this man? Let me suggest to you that the man was no closet demoniac who all of a sudden came out in some odd and frightening way when Jesus entered the synagogue. This is not an instance of a hidden, dark side of someone who everyone thought they knew, and then it suddenly comes to light. Rather, this demonic voice is a common voice of privilege and a common voice of prejudice shared by everyone whose limited understanding of God and of God's grace stands as a basis for excluding outsiders from an open welcome into the synagogue of God. It's the common voice that we hear every day, everywhere in the world, in every synagogue, every gathering together of self-selected souls seeking to save, seeking to preserve their own exclusive privilege over against the needs and desires and welfare of the rest of God's good creation. In other words, the spirit that compels this man to speak in Capernaum is not necessarily a spirit that might have been considered unclean by the other members of the synagogue. His voice may not have sounded demonic to them because they shared his basic fears and his basic concerns as they were being met with this Jesus challenge. Can you imagine how this voice might sound in one of our modern-day synagogues, better known to us as churches? What do you do with a Jesus who says, Share your extensive wardrobe with people who don't have enough clothes to keep them warm in the cold days of winter. What do you do with a Jesus who says, sell your luxury cars and your gas-guzzling SUVs and give the proceeds to the Eugene Mission to help out the more and more people living below the poverty level each day? What do you do with a Jesus who says, love your enemy? Love your enemy who hijacks civilian-loaded airliners and flies them into buildings, icons of material and military prowess. Do not return evil for evil. What do you do with a Jesus who says, treat the alien in your midst just like one of your own family members? What do you do with a Jesus who says that prostitutes and drug addicts and tax collectors and non-Christians and whomever else you may want to label as a sinner, that these people may actually be closer to God's kingdom than are the members of the Christian communities that want to exclude them? Jesus of Nazareth, have you come to destroy us? Oh, yes. You'd better believe that Jesus has come to destroy the demonic voice of privilege and prejudice. Just take a look at synagogue number 2. And as you look at synagogue number 2, you should take heart. We all should take heart. Because even those who are possessed and driven by demons of privilege and prejudice are welcome here also. They're just not allowed to speak that much. They enter the synagogue of Jesus on the same basis as everyone else does. Sicknesses are healed. Sins are forgiven. Demons are driven out at the door. And the whole city is welcome to come together at the door of Jesus. And no prejudice is permitted. No exclusive privilege is exercised for the advantage of some and to the disadvantage of others. All are equal in standing as they stand before the door of Christ's synagogue. Oh, and there's one other important thing about this particular unclean spirit of privilege and prejudice. It doesn't hurt and it doesn't harm people to lose that demon. For all the pious protest of self-preservation, for all of the kicking and screaming that these demons can cause, for all the hysterics and the theatrics, for all the concern about the destruction when these demons of privilege and prejudice are challenged, we find an encouraging word in Luke's account of this story. He adds one more detail about this man with the unclean spirit. He says, when commanded by Jesus, the demon came out of the man without injuring him. The demon came out of the man having done him no harm whatsoever. It does not harm us to be rid of the demon of prejudice and privilege. Thanks be to God. Amen.